The night was calm, the kind of calm that felt unnaturally heavy. The stars blinked faintly above the small cemetery nestled on the edge of town, a solemn patch of land surrounded by a wrought iron fence that creaked with every passing breeze. Evelyn sat on the living room couch, her hands trembling as she pressed the play button on her laptop. Beside her, Thomas leaned forward, his jaw clenched, the flickering light from the screen casting sharp shadows across his face. For weeks, they had endured the heartbreak of visiting their daughter Lily's grave, only to find it disturbed. Flowers they had left carefully arranged were trampled or missing entirely. Trinkets placed lovingly at the base of her headstone disappeared overnight. Once, Evelyn had found an unsettling pattern of scratches carved into the soil, as though something or someone had been clawing at the earth. The cemetery caretaker had no answers, shrugging it off as likely the work of bored teenagers or wild animals. But Evelyn and Thomas knew this was more than mischief. Lily had been their only child, their world. She had just turned 17 when a rainy night on a slick road claimed her life. The memory of the police officer standing at their doorstep, his hat held respectfully in his hands, was still vivid. The words, accident, and instant, repeated in their heads, meaningless against the tidal wave of grief that swept them into an abyss. Losing her was unbearable, but finding her grave disturbed felt like losing her all over again. Evelyn's idea to install a hidden camera had been born from desperation. She needed to know. If it was some cruel prank, they would catch whoever was responsible and put an end to the torment. But as the footage played on the screen, what they saw left them breathless. The grainy black and white recording revealed a figure emerging from the shadows just past midnight. Cloaked in a dark hoodie, their face obscured, the figure moved directly to Lily's grave with an unnerving certainty, as though they had done this before. The visitor knelt, their movements slow and deliberate. Evelyn gasped when the figure pulled something from their pocket, a small object glinting faintly in the dim light, and began digging into the dirt with bare hands. Thomas leaned closer, his fists tightening as the figure placed the object, a pendant? A coin, on the grave before retreating back into the night. "That's not an animal," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "That's not some random teenager." Thomas didn't reply immediately. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what they'd just witnessed. The figure's actions seemed ritualistic, almost reverent, but there was an unease to it too, as if they were performing some private, macabre ceremony. "We need to tell someone," he said finally, though he wasn't sure who. "The police?" He'd already dismissed their concerns once. Thomas felt a deep frustration bubbling beneath his grief, a helplessness that gnawed at him. The next morning, Evelyn convinced Thomas to visit the cemetery again. Armed with gloves and a small trowel, they carefully dug where the figure had been. Sure enough, they unearthed a tiny metal object, a locket, tarnished and scratched with age. Inside was a picture of Lily, smiling brightly, and an inscription on the opposite side, "Always watching over you." Evelyn's hands shook as she stared at the locket. This isn't hers. She didn't own anything like this. "Then whose is it?" Thomas asked, his voice low. Their thoughts turned to the visitor. Who could they be? A friend of Lily's they didn't know about? A stranger obsessed with their daughter? The questions only deepened the couple's anxiety. Thomas decided to stay up that night, watching the live feed from the hidden camera, determined to catch the figure in real time. Evelyn tried to sleep but found herself staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the image of the cloaked figure over and over again. Midnight came and went. Thomas sipped his coffee, his eyes glued to the laptop screen. The cemetery remained still, the headstones standing like silent sentinels under the moonlight. Just when he began to think the visitor wouldn't show, a movement caught his eye. His breath hitched as the shadowy figure emerged, this time carrying a small backpack. Thomas whispered urgently to Evelyn, who rushed to his side. Together, they watched as the figure once again approached Lily's grave. The backpack was set down, and the figure pulled out several items: a folded piece of paper, a candle, and what appeared to be a single rose. The ritual began anew, the visitor lighting the candle and placing it carefully beside the headstone, then unfolding the paper and reading silently. Evelyn's heart pounded as the figure stood abruptly, as if sensing they were being watched. The hooded head turned slightly, scanning the darkness before retreating quickly, leaving the candle flickering beside the grave. Thomas grabbed a flashlight and bolted out the door, Evelyn chasing after him. "What are you doing?" she hissed, fear evident in her voice. "I need to know who they are," Thomas yelled over his shoulder. When they reached the cemetery, the visitor was gone, but the remnants of their visit remained. Evelyn picked up the paper, her hands trembling as she read the words scrawled in neat handwriting. "I'm so sorry. I failed you." "Who would write this?" Evelyn asked, tears streaming down her face. "What does it mean?" Thomas was silent, his mind churning. The pieces weren't adding up. The locket, the notes, the candle, this wasn't just the work of a stranger. This was personal. The next day, Thomas approached the local police with the footage and the items they had found. At first, the officer on duty seemed skeptical, dismissing it as someone struggling with their own grief who had latched onto Lily's memory. But when Thomas insisted on a deeper investigation, the officer agreed to review the footage and keep an eye on the cemetery. Meanwhile, Evelyn decided to dig deeper into Lily's life. She went through her daughter's belongings, looking for anything that might explain the visitor's actions. Hidden at the bottom of a drawer, she found a journal Lily had kept. Most of the entries were normal teenage musings, friends, school, dreams for the future, but one passage stood out. April 3rd. Something strange is going on. I keep getting these weird messages online, like someone's watching me. They keep asking questions about Mom and Dad, about our family. I told Alan about it, but he says I'm overthinking. Maybe he's right. Alan, Evelyn whispered. Lily had mentioned him a few times as a friend, but Evelyn had never known the two were close. Could Alan be the visitor? Could he know more than he'd let on? That evening, Evelyn and Thomas decided to find Alan. When they arrived at his house, Alan's mother greeted them hesitantly, her eyes widening when they explained why they were there. "Alan's been spending a lot of time at the cemetery," she admitted, her voice strained. "He told me he felt guilty about something, but he wouldn't say what." Alan, pale and visibly shaken, finally agreed to talk. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "I loved Lily. We were together, but we kept it secret. She didn't want anyone to know." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, secret?" "Why?" "Because someone was threatening her," Alan confessed. "She wouldn't tell me who, but she thought it had to do with something she found out about the town council. She was scared, Mrs. Collins. I tried to protect her, but I didn't know how." Thomas's fists clenched. "Why didn't you come to us? Or the police?" Alan hung his head. "She begged me not to. She said she could handle it. I didn't think it would end like this." As Alan spoke, Evelyn and Thomas realized the truth was far darker than they had imagined. Lily's death wasn't just a tragic accident. It was part of something much bigger, something sinister that had been hiding in plain sight. Their daughter's grave wasn't just a place of mourning. It was the key. The weight of Alan's confession left Evelyn and Thomas reeling. For days, they had been chasing the mystery of the graveyard visitor, thinking it was tied to grief or a strange obsession. Now, they realized it was connected to something far more sinister. Evelyn sat quietly in the car on the way back home, staring blankly at the dashboard while Thomas gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Neither spoke, their minds racing to process what they had learned. Back at home, Evelyn broke the silence. If Lily was scared of someone, why didn't she come to us? Why didn't she trust us enough to tell us what was happening? Her voice cracked, the raw pain of a mother grappling with her daughter's fear and secrets bleeding through. Thomas rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. We can't go back and fix that now, Evelyn. But Alan's story, it changes everything. If someone threatened her because of what she found out, this wasn't just an accident. We need to figure out what she knew. The idea that Lily might have uncovered a dangerous secret about the town council seemed unbelievable at first, but the more Evelyn thought about it, the more it started to fit. Their town was small, tightly knit, and on the surface, it seemed idyllic. But like any place, it had its share of corruption. There had been rumors in the past, murmurs about shady deals and misuse of public funds, but nothing ever came of them. People looked the other way, either out of fear or indifference. Was it possible Lily had stumbled onto something that others had missed or ignored? Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn went back to Lily's journal. She read every page carefully, looking for clues that might point to what her daughter had been investigating. There were more mentions of the strange messages Lily had received online, but they were vague, with no specific details about who had sent them. Then, toward the back of the journal, Evelyn found something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a list of names, hastily scribbled and partially crossed out. Councilman Rhodes. Mayor Haskins. Tricia Wentworth, Treasurer. Beside the names, Lily had written a single word, payments. Evelyn's hands trembled as she stared at the page. This wasn't just idle curiosity. Lily had been piecing together something about the town's leadership. The implications were chilling. If Lily had discovered evidence of corruption, embezzlement, perhaps, it might explain why someone had threatened her. It could even explain why she was gone. Thomas leaned over her shoulder, reading the names aloud. Rhodes, Haskins, Wentworth. They've all been in office for years. Evelyn closed the journal carefully. We need to talk to someone who can help. Someone outside the town. Thomas hesitated. Like who? The police won't touch this without proof, and if it's tied to local government, we don't know who we can trust. What about Alan? Evelyn suggested. He said Lily told him about the threats. Maybe she shared more with him than he let on. They decided to confront Alan again, this time pressing him for more details. When they arrived at his house the next morning, Alan seemed reluctant to talk. His guilt over not protecting Lily was evident, and he seemed scared, of what, they weren't sure. Alan, Thomas said firmly, if you know anything else, now is the time to tell us. Lily was our daughter. We deserve to know the truth. Alan sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. She didn't tell me everything, he admitted. But there's one thing. She gave me a flash drive a week before she died. She told me to keep it safe and not to look at it unless something happened to her. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. Do you still have it? Alan nodded. Yeah. I've been too scared to open it. I didn't know what I'd find, and I didn't want to get dragged into something I couldn't handle. He disappeared into his room and returned a few minutes later with a small, silver USB drive. Thomas took it carefully, as though it were a fragile relic. We'll look at it, he said. If there's anything on here that can explain what happened to Lily, we'll find it. Back at home, Evelyn and Thomas plugged the drive into their computer. The folder that popped up was labeled Truth in all caps. Inside were several files, documents, spreadsheets, and a few audio recordings. Evelyn opened the first document, her heart pounding. It was a list of transactions, all with large sums of money being transferred from what appeared to be town accounts to private offshore accounts. The recipients were listed by name: Rhodes, Haskins, Wentworth. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars diverted over the course of several years. Evelyn felt her stomach churn as the extent of the corruption became clear. Thomas played one of the audio files. It was a recording of a heated conversation between two men, one of whom they recognized as Councilman Rhodes. "She knows too much," Rhodes said, his voice tense. "If she goes to the police, we're finished." "You think I don't know that?" another voice replied. "We'll handle it. She's just a kid. She'll back off once we scare her a little." Evelyn covered her mouth in horror. This was it. Proof that Lily had been threatened, and possibly more. Her hands shook as she turned to Thomas. "We have to take this to someone who can do something about it." Thomas nodded grimly. "But we need to be careful." They decided to contact a journalist from a neighboring city, someone with no ties to their town who could help expose the corruption. Evelyn reached out to an investigative reporter named Carla Mason, known for her fearless exposés. When Carla heard their story and saw the evidence, she agreed to help immediately. "This is explosive," Carla said during their first meeting. "But you need to understand, once we go public with this, there's no turning back. These people will do everything they can to protect themselves." Evelyn and Thomas understood the risks, but they were determined to see it through. They couldn't let Lily's death be in vain. Over the next few days, Carla worked tirelessly to verify the evidence and prepare a detailed report. She also interviewed Evelyn, Thomas, and Alan, piecing together the full story of what had happened. Meanwhile, the cemetery visitor remained a mystery. Evelyn and Thomas continued to monitor the hidden camera, hoping to catch the figure again. But nights passed with no sign of them, leaving Evelyn to wonder if they had been scared off, or if they had already played their part. As the days turned into weeks, Carla's report was ready. It was a bombshell, exposing years of corruption and implicating several high-ranking officials in the town. She planned to publish it online and share it with major news outlets, ensuring it couldn't be silenced. The night before the report went live, Evelyn and Thomas sat together in the living room, their nerves on edge. They knew the fallout would be immense. Their quiet, unassuming town would never be the same. But as they looked at the photo of Lily on the mantel, they felt a sense of peace. They were doing this for her. Around midnight, the hidden camera feed caught Evelyn's attention. The visitor had returned. This time, they weren't alone. A second figure accompanied them, and both appeared to be carrying shovels. Evelyn gasped and woke Thomas, who immediately grabbed his coat and a flashlight. When they arrived at the cemetery, the two figures were still there, standing by Lily's grave. "Stop!" Thomas shouted, shining the flashlight on them. The figures froze, then turned slowly. Evelyn's breath caught as she recognized one of them. It was Councilman Rhodes. "What are you doing here?" Thomas demanded, his voice shaking with fury. Rhodes sneered, dropping the shovel. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourselves into," he said coldly. "Sometimes the truth needs to stay buried." Evelyn felt a surge of fear and anger. "You threatened our daughter," she said, her voice trembling. "You're the reason she's gone." Rhodes didn't deny it. Instead, he took a step forward, his expression dark. "If you know what's good for you, you'll walk away. You think you've found justice, but all you've done is put a target on your backs." Thomas stepped in front of Evelyn protectively. "We're not afraid." Before Rhodes could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Carla had called the police, anticipating that the report might provoke retaliation. Officers arrived moments later, arresting Rhodes and his accomplice. As they were led away in handcuffs, Evelyn felt a wave of relief, but also a deep sadness. The fight for justice wasn't over, but at least Lily's voice had been heard. The next morning, Carla's report went live, sending shockwaves through the community. Residents were outraged, demanding accountability and calling for immediate resignations. For Evelyn and Thomas, it was bittersweet. They had uncovered the truth, but it had come at an unimaginable cost. As they stood by Lily's grave that evening, Evelyn placed a single white rose on the headstone. "We did it, sweetheart," she whispered. "We found the truth. And we'll keep fighting, for you." The wind carried her words into the night, a quiet promise that Lily's legacy would never be forgotten. The aftermath of Councilman Rhodes's arrest was chaotic, but it marked only the beginning of a far-reaching unraveling. News of the corruption scandal spread like wildfire. Within days, the small town was thrust into the national spotlight, with reporters swarming the streets, seeking interviews and footage of the once quiet community. For Evelyn and Thomas, it was overwhelming. The fight for justice for their daughter was far from over, and they knew that the stakes were higher than ever. Evelyn found herself glued to the television, watching coverage of the scandal unfold. Every report brought a mix of emotions: satisfaction that the truth was coming to light and heartbreak that Lily wasn't there to see it. Thomas, on the other hand, threw himself into ensuring their family's safety. The warning Rhodes had issued at the cemetery still echoed in his mind, and he refused to take any chances. He installed new locks, security cameras, and even reinforced the doors and windows of their home. Their lives had become a whirlwind of legal meetings, interviews, and public scrutiny. Carla Mason, the journalist who had broken the story, worked closely with them, ensuring the evidence against Rhodes, Mayor Haskins, and Treasurer Wentworth was airtight. But Evelyn and Thomas quickly realized that their involvement made them targets, not just of those implicated in the scandal but also of the townspeople who were grappling with the fallout. One evening, as Evelyn returned from a grocery run, she noticed a group of neighbors gathered near her driveway. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence felt confrontational. She hesitated before stepping out of the car. Evelyn, one of them, a woman named Harriet, began, her tone cold, "We need to talk." Evelyn braced herself. "What is it? You've brought nothing but trouble to this town." "Businesses are suffering, people are losing their jobs, and it's all because of you and your crusade." Evelyn's chest tightened. "Our crusade?" Lily was threatened. She was killed because of what she uncovered. "This isn't just about us, it's about justice." "Justice?" another neighbor chimed in. "What about the innocent people caught in the crossfire? My brother worked for the mayor's office. He's out of a job now, and he had nothing to do with any of this." Evelyn clenched her fists, struggling to contain her anger. "If you want to blame someone, blame the people who stole from this town, not the ones who exposed them." The group murmured among themselves, clearly unconvinced. Evelyn felt the weight of their resentment as she made her way into the house. She slammed the door behind her, tears streaming down her face. "They hate us," she said to Thomas, her voice trembling. "They hate us for trying to do the right thing." Thomas pulled her into a tight embrace. "Let them hate us. We're not doing this for them. We're doing it for Lily." But the hostility didn't stop there. Over the next few days, they received anonymous threats, letters slipped under their door, phone calls in the dead of night, and even a brick through their living room window. The message was clear: someone wanted them to back off. Despite the mounting pressure, Evelyn and Thomas refused to be intimidated. They worked with Carla to push for further investigations into the town's leadership, uncovering even more layers of corruption. The evidence revealed a web of bribery, kickbacks, and even ties to organized crime. As each revelation came to light, the town's power structure crumbled. Mayor Haskins resigned in disgrace, followed by Treasurer Wentworth. Both faced criminal charges, and the public outrage grew louder with each passing day. The townspeople who had once been angry at Evelyn and Thomas now turned their ire toward the real culprits. Protests erupted outside the town hall, with residents demanding accountability and transparency. But amid the chaos, Evelyn and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. They still didn't have concrete answers about what had happened to Lily. The flash drive had provided crucial evidence, but it didn't explain the circumstances of her death. Had it truly been an accident, or was there more to the story? Their questions were answered in the most unexpected way. One night, as Evelyn sat in the living room scrolling through old photos of Lily, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "I know what happened to Lily." Her heart pounded as businesses are suffering, people are losing their jobs, and it's all because of you and your crusade. Evelyn's chest tightened. Our crusade? Lily was threatened. She was killed because of what she uncovered. This isn't just about us, it's about justice. Justice? Another neighbor chimed in. What about the innocent people caught in the crossfire? My brother worked for the mayor's office. He's out of a job now, and he had nothing to do with any of this. Evelyn clenched her fists, struggling to contain her anger. If you want to blame someone, blame the people who stole from this town, not the ones who exposed them. The group murmured among themselves, clearly unconvinced. Evelyn felt the weight of their resentment as she made her way into the house. She slammed the door behind her, tears streaming down her face. They hate us, she said to Thomas, her voice trembling. They hate us for trying to do the right thing. Thomas pulled her into a tight embrace. Let them hate us. We're not doing this for them. We're doing it for Lily. But the hostility didn't stop there. Over the next few days, they received anonymous threats, letters slipped under their door, phone calls in the dead of night, and even a brick through their living room window. The message was clear, someone wanted them to back off. Despite the mounting pressure, Evelyn and Thomas refused to be intimidated. They worked with Carla to push for further investigations into the town's leadership, uncovering even more layers of corruption. The evidence revealed a web of bribery, kickbacks, and even ties to organized crime. As each revelation came to light, the town's power structure crumbled. Mayor Haskins resigned in disgrace, followed by Treasurer Wentworth. Both faced criminal charges, and the public outrage grew louder with each passing day. The townspeople who had once been angry at Evelyn and Thomas now turned their ire toward the real culprits. Protests erupted outside the town hall, with residents demanding accountability and transparency. But amid the chaos, Evelyn and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. They still didn't have concrete answers about what had happened to Lily. The flash drive had provided crucial evidence, but it didn't explain the circumstances of her death. Had it truly been an accident, or was there more to the story? Their questions were answered in the most unexpected way. One night, as Evelyn sat in the living room scrolling through old photos of Lily, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "I know what happened to Lily." Her heart pounded as Evelyn clutched it tightly, her mind racing. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers from the people who had taken her daughter's life. But instead, she turned to Jason. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for telling me." As Evelyn and Jason left the mill, Thomas stepped out of the shadows, his face grim. They drove home in silence, the weight of Jason's confession hanging heavily in the air. Back at the house, Evelyn opened the folder. Inside were more documents, contracts, bank statements, and emails, further implicating the town's leadership. But one document stood out, a handwritten note from Lily. "If you're reading this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. Please don't let them get away with this. The truth matters." Evelyn clutched the note to her chest, her tears falling freely. Lily's bravery and determination shone through even in the face of danger. Now, it was up to her and Thomas to honor their daughter's legacy by ensuring the truth was fully exposed. The fight wasn't over, but they were more determined than ever to see it through to the end. The days that followed Jason's confession were a whirlwind of fear, anger, and determination for Evelyn and Thomas. The folder they had received felt like a key that unlocked more than just evidence. It revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed Lily's life. Evelyn pored over the documents for hours, her emotions swinging wildly between sorrow and rage. Every page contained details that painted a damning picture of the town's power structure. These weren't just petty crimes or minor ethical lapses, this was systematic theft and exploitation on a scale she could hardly fathom. Yet, buried within the paperwork was something even more sinister. A single page stood out, a list of names and numbers, most of which didn't make sense at first glance. Some of the names were familiar, tied to influential figures in the community, but others were completely foreign. The numbers seemed to correspond to financial transactions, though their purpose was unclear. Evelyn's gut told her this was a piece of a larger puzzle, but without context, she couldn't be sure. One name, however, caught her attention: Marcus Trent. She didn't recognize it, but the name appeared several times alongside large sums of money. Evelyn showed the papers to Thomas, who frowned as he scanned the list. "This Marcus Trent must be important," he said. "Whoever he is, he's clearly connected to all of this." Evelyn nodded. "We need to find out who he is and why he's tied to all these transactions. If we can figure that out, we might be able to connect the dots." Carla Mason, the journalist who had been their ally throughout the ordeal, agreed to meet them that evening to review the folder's contents. When Carla arrived at their home, her demeanor was as Carla leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. "Money laundering, embezzlement, bribery, this list suggests a network of illicit activity that stretches far beyond this town." "And Marcus Trent? I've heard that name before. He's a financier with a reputation for shady dealings, but no one's ever been able to pin anything on him." Thomas crossed his arms. "So what's he doing tied up in our town's mess?" Carla shrugged. "That's what we need to find out. If Trent is involved, he's not just some peripheral player. He's a power broker, someone who connects the dots for people who want to stay in the shadows." The weight of Carla's words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Evelyn felt a renewed sense of urgency. If Marcus Trent was as dangerous as Carla suggested, then uncovering his role could put them all in even greater danger. But it could also be the key to unraveling the entire web of corruption. Over the next few days, Evelyn, Thomas, and Carla worked tirelessly to piece together the clues in the folder. Carla reached out to her network of sources, hoping to learn more about Trent's activities. Meanwhile, Evelyn and Thomas focused on analyzing the documents, searching for patterns or connections they might have missed. It was grueling work, but every small breakthrough felt like a step closer to justice. One night, as Evelyn sifted through the papers for what felt like the 100th time, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a watermark on one of the pages. It was faint, barely visible, but it resembled a logo she couldn't place. She showed it to Thomas, who squinted at the mark. "Looks like some kind of corporate logo," he said. "But it's too blurry to make out." Carla, who had been typing furiously on her laptop, glanced up. "Let me see." She studied the watermark for a moment before her eyes widened. "That's the logo for Templar Holdings. It's one of Trent's shell companies." Evelyn's heart raced. "What does that mean?" "It means this document is more than just evidence of local corruption," Carla said. "If it's tied to Templar Holdings, then it's a direct link to Trent's operations. This could be the smoking gun we've been looking for." But just as the pieces were starting to fall into place, a new threat emerged. That evening, as Evelyn and Thomas prepared for bed, their phone rang. The number was unlisted, but Evelyn answered, hoping it was Carla with more information. Instead, a deep, unfamiliar voice greeted her. "You're digging too deep," the voice said. "Stop now, or you'll regret it." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" The caller didn't answer. Instead, the line went dead, leaving Evelyn shaking with fear. She told Thomas about the call, and his face darkened with anger. "They're trying to scare us," he said. "We can't let them." But the threats didn't stop. Over the next few days, one morning, they woke to find the words "Keep Quiet" spray-painted on their garage door. Evelyn felt like she was living in a nightmare, but she refused to back down. If anything, the threats only strengthened her resolve. Carla, too, was undeterred. She continued to investigate Trent, uncovering a trail of suspicious transactions that linked him to other high-profile scandals across the state. Her reporting drew national attention, and soon federal investigators were involved. It seemed like the tide was turning, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. That feeling was confirmed when Jason called them one evening, his voice trembling with fear. "I think someone's following me," he said. "I keep seeing the same car parked outside my apartment. I don't know what to do." Evelyn and Thomas immediately went to Jason's apartment, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone. Jason was visibly shaken, and Evelyn could see the guilt in his eyes. "I never should have come forward," he said. "Now they're after me too." "You did the right thing," Evelyn said firmly. "And we're going to protect you. They won't get away with this." But even as she spoke the words, Evelyn knew how fragile their situation was. The forces they were up against were powerful and ruthless, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Yet, she also knew they couldn't stop now. Lily's memory deserved justice, and so did the countless others who had been hurt by the corruption. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation reached a boiling point. Carla's reporting had exposed enough to warrant a federal raid on Templar Holdings, and Marcus Trent's name was splashed across headlines nationwide. But Trent was elusive, and his network of allies made it difficult to pin him down. Evelyn and Thomas knew their fight wasn't over, but they also felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, it seemed like justice was within reach. But then, just when they thought they were making progress, tragedy struck. One morning, Evelyn received a call from Carla's editor. Carla had been in a car accident on her way to meet with a source. She was alive but in critical condition, and the circumstances of the crash were suspicious. Evelyn's heart sank. She knew this was no coincidence. As she sat by Carla's hospital bed that evening, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of determination. The people responsible for all of this, the corruption, the threats, the violence, were trying to silence them. But Evelyn refused to let them win. She would see this fight through to the end, no matter the cost. For Lily. For Carla. For the town that deserved better. The battle was far from over. Evelyn sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands trembling as she clutched a styrofoam cup of coffee she didn't intend to drink. Thomas paced nearby, his footsteps echoing against the sterile tile floor. The night had been long, and Carla's accident weighed heavily on them both. Despite the odds, Carla had survived the crash, but the doctors weren't certain how long her recovery would take. The investigators had called it a freak accident, but Evelyn's gut told her otherwise. Too many things had happened in too short a time for this to be coincidental. The people they were exposing had sent a clear message: stop, or face the consequences. Jason arrived at the hospital an hour later, his face pale and drawn. "How is she?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "She's stable," Evelyn replied, trying to muster some reassurance. "But it'll be a long road." Jason sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "This is my fault. If I hadn't come forward, none of this would be happening. Evelyn shook her head, her voice firm. Don't you dare blame yourself. You did the right thing, Jason. We're here because the truth needs to come out, and they're scared. That means we're making progress. Thomas stopped pacing and sat beside Evelyn. She's right. They're playing dirty because they're losing control. We need to keep pushing. If we back off now, everything Carla's fought for, everything Lily died for, will mean nothing. Jason nodded reluctantly, though the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. What's our next move? That was the question that had haunted Evelyn since Carla's accident. They had mountains of evidence, but connecting all the dots required expertise they didn't have. With Carla temporarily out of commission, their strongest ally in investigative journalism was gone. But Evelyn refused to let that stop them. She leaned forward, her mind racing. We need help. Someone who can look at what we have and find the weak spot in their armor. Thomas frowned. And who's going to do that? Everyone we trust is either too scared or already a target. Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to the folder, to the name Marcus Trent, and to the mysterious web of transactions that tied everything together. Suddenly, an idea struck her. What about a whistleblower? Someone from inside Trent's operation? Jason looked skeptical. You think someone that deep in would turn on him? People like Trent don't leave loose ends. Everyone has a breaking point, Evelyn said. We just have to find the right person. The plan was risky, bordering on reckless, but Evelyn couldn't see another way forward. Over the next several days, she and Thomas combed through Carla's notes, searching for any mention of individuals who had worked for or with Marcus Trent. It was slow, tedious work, but their According to Carla's notes, Victoria had been a high-ranking executive at one of Trent's subsidiaries before resigning abruptly 3 years ago. The circumstances of her departure were murky, but rumors suggested she had fallen out of favor with Trent. Evelyn was willing to bet there was more to the story. Finding Victoria proved to be a challenge. She had gone off the grid after leaving Trent's company, with no social media presence or public records of her whereabouts. But Evelyn refused to give up. She reached out to Carla's network of sources, using every connection she could think of to track Victoria down. Finally, after days of dead ends, they got a lead. A private investigator Carla had worked with occasionally had an address for Victoria in a small town 2 hours away. Evelyn and Thomas made the trip early the next morning, leaving Jason behind to keep an eye on Carla. As they drove through the winding country roads, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that passed seemed to linger a moment too long, every shadow along the roadside felt like a threat. But she pushed the fear aside, focusing instead on the hope that Victoria might hold the key to breaking this case wide open. When they arrived at the address, they found a modest house nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The curtains were drawn, and the lawn looked like it hadn't been mowed in weeks. Evelyn's heart raced as she approached the front door and knocked. For a moment, there was no response, and she began to wonder if they had the wrong address. But then the door opened a crack, and a woman's face appeared, a face lined with weariness and guarded suspicion. Victoria Hayes? Evelyn asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. The woman hesitated before nodding. Who's asking? My name is Evelyn Carter. This is my husband, Thomas. We need your help. It's about Marcus Trent. Victoria's expression hardened, and she started to close the door. I don't know anything about him. Leave me alone. Wait. Evelyn said, stepping forward. Please, just hear us out. We've uncovered evidence of a massive corruption scheme, and your name came up. We think you might have information that could help us bring him down. Victoria paused, her hand on the doorframe. And why would I help you? Do you have any idea what kind of man Trent is? If he finds out I've talked to you, I'm as good as dead. Evelyn met her gaze, her voice filled with determination. Because this isn't just about us. It's about justice for my daughter, for all the people he's hurt. And because if we don't stop him, he'll keep doing it. You have the power to make a difference. For a long moment, Victoria said nothing. Then she sighed and opened the door wider. Come in. But make it quick. Inside, the house was sparse and dimly lit. She led them to the living room and gestured for them to sit. I'll tell you what I know, but you didn't hear it from me. Understand? Evelyn nodded. We understand. Victoria took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. I worked for Trent for 5 years. At first, I thought I was just managing legitimate investments, but it didn't take long to see what was really going on. He's not just laundering money, he's funding criminal enterprises, human trafficking, arms deals, you name it. When I tried to leave, he made it clear I'd never be safe if I talked. Evelyn's stomach turned as Victoria detailed the extent of Trent's operations. The transactions in the folder suddenly made sense, each one a piece of a much larger puzzle. But Victoria's story also revealed something they hadn't expected, a hidden account that Trent used to funnel money to his most trusted allies. If they could find that account, they might be able to expose not just Trent, but everyone in his network. Do you have any proof? Thomas asked. Victoria hesitated, then stood and walked to a bookshelf. She pulled out a worn leather journal and handed it to Evelyn. I kept notes. It's not much, but it's all I could take with me when I left. Evelyn flipped through the journal, her heart pounding as she saw page after page of detailed accounts, dates, and names. This was it, the missing piece they needed. But before they could celebrate, a loud crash came from the front of the house. Victoria's face paled. They found me, she whispered. Evelyn and Thomas barely had time to react before the door burst open, and 3 men stormed in, their faces obscured by masks. One of them pointed a gun at Victoria. You should have stayed quiet, he growled. Thomas stepped forward, his hands raised. We don't want any trouble. Just let us go. The man sneered. It's too late for that. Evelyn's mind raced as she clutched the journal to her chest. She couldn't let them take it, not after everything they'd been through. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, she lunged toward the nearest man, catching him off guard. The journal slipped from her grasp in the struggle, but Thomas quickly scooped it up and ran for the back door. Go! Thomas hesitated for only a moment before nodding and disappearing into the night. Evelyn braced herself for the worst, but the sound of sirens in the distance made the intruders pause. One of them cursed under his breath. Let's get out of here. The men fled as quickly as they had arrived, leaving Evelyn shaken but alive. Moments later, the police arrived, and Thomas returned with the journal still in hand. It was a small victory, but Evelyn knew the battle was far from over. The evidence they now possessed was enough to bring Trent's empire crashing down, but only if they could survive long enough to use it. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed in the small, nondescript motel room they had fled to after the attack. The journal rested on the bedside table, its worn leather cover a stark reminder of the danger they were in and the responsibility they bore. Thomas was pacing again, his nervous energy filling the room as Jason stared blankly at the TV, which played a muted news report about a local politician's fundraiser. It felt surreal that the world outside continued as normal while theirs teetered on the brink of collapse. The attack at Victoria's house had been a sobering reminder of what they were up against. Marcus Trent wasn't just a criminal mastermind, he was a man who commanded loyalty through fear and ruthlessness. Yet, despite the danger, Evelyn couldn't bring herself to regret their decision. They had the journal, proof that could expose not just Trent but the entire network of corruption he had built. It was their chance to make a real difference, to honor Lily's memory and Carla's sacrifices. But the question remained, how could they safely use the evidence without getting themselves or anyone else killed? Thomas broke the silence, his voice tight with frustration. "We can't keep hiding forever, Evelyn. They'll find us eventually. We need a plan." Evelyn nodded, her mind racing. "We have the journal, but we need a way to share it with the world. Something they can't silence or erase." Jason leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What about going straight to the media? A big outlet that can publish everything at once?" Thomas shook his head. "You think Trent doesn't have people in the media? He's probably got half the city's journalists on his payroll. No, we need someone who can't be bought." Evelyn's thoughts turned to Carla, who had always been fearless in her pursuit of the truth. If only she were here, she'd know what to do. But then Evelyn remembered something Carla had once said, "The truth is a wildfire. Once it starts, it's unstoppable." A spark of inspiration lit up in her mind. "We don't need just one outlet," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We can release the information everywhere: social media, independent journalists, international news organizations. If we flood the system, Trent won't." Thomas hesitated for only a moment before nodding and disappearing into the night. Evelyn braced herself for the worst, but the sound of sirens in the distance made the intruders pause. One of them cursed under his breath. "Let's get out of here." The men fled as quickly as they had arrived, leaving Evelyn shaken but alive. Moments later, the police arrived, and Thomas returned with the journal still in hand. It was a small victory, but Evelyn knew the battle was far from over. The evidence they now possessed was enough to bring Trent's empire crashing down, but only if they could survive long enough to use it. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed in the small, nondescript motel room they had fled to after the attack. The journal rested on the bedside table, its worn leather cover a stark reminder of the danger they were in and the responsibility they bore. Thomas was pacing again, his nervous energy filling the room as Jason stared blankly at the TV, which played a muted news report about a local politician's fundraiser. It felt surreal that the world outside continued as normal while theirs teetered on the brink of collapse. The attack at Victoria's house had been a sobering reminder of what they were up against. Marcus Trent wasn't just a criminal mastermind, he was a man who commanded loyalty through fear and ruthlessness. Yet, despite the danger, Evelyn couldn't bring herself to regret their decision. They had the journal, proof that could expose not just Trent but the entire network of corruption he had built. It was their chance to make a real difference, to honor Lily's memory and Carla's sacrifices. But the question remained, how could they safely use the evidence without getting themselves or anyone else killed? Thomas broke the silence, his voice tight with frustration. "We can't keep hiding forever, Evelyn. They'll find us eventually. We need a plan." Evelyn nodded, her mind racing. "We have the journal, but we need a way to share it with the world. Something they can't silence or erase." Jason leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What about going straight to the media? A big outlet that can publish everything at once?" Thomas shook his head. "You think Trent doesn't have people in the media? He's probably got half the city's journalists on his payroll. No, we need someone who can't be bought." Evelyn's thoughts turned to Carla, who had always been fearless in her pursuit of the truth. If only she were here, she'd know what to do. But then Evelyn remembered something Carla had once said, "The truth is a wildfire. Once it starts, it's unstoppable." A spark of inspiration lit up in her mind. "We don't need just one outlet," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We can release the information everywhere: social media, independent journalists, international news organizations. If we flood the system, Trent won't." "What do you want?" Jason asked warily. Cypher considered this for a moment before replying, "When this is all over, I want access to Trent's offshore accounts. Not for me, there are people he's hurt who deserve compensation. I want to make sure they get it." Evelyn exchanged a glance with Thomas and Jason before nodding. "Deal." Cypher set to work immediately, scanning the journal and encrypting the files. He uploaded them to a secure server and began distributing the information to contacts around the world. Independent journalists, activists, and even foreign media outlets received copies of the evidence, along with detailed instructions on how to verify its authenticity. As the hours ticked by, Evelyn and the others waited anxiously, their nerves frayed. Then, slowly but surely, the first reports began to surface. Headlines blared accusations of corruption, money laundering, and human trafficking, all tied to Marcus Trent and his associates. Social media erupted with outrage, as people shared the stories and demanded justice. But the fight was far from over. Trent's lawyers issued swift denials, and his allies scrambled to discredit the evidence. Evelyn knew they had to stay one step ahead. She worked tirelessly with Cypher to provide additional documentation and ensure the story couldn't be buried. Then, just as it seemed they were gaining ground, a chilling message arrived, a photo of Evelyn, Thomas, and Jason, taken from outside their motel room. The message read, "Stop, or you'll wish you had." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "They know where we are." Cypher's eyes darkened. "You need to move. Now." They packed up and left within minutes, driving through the night to another safe house. But the threat only strengthened their resolve. The more Trent pushed back, the more determined they became to see this through. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure on Trent mounted. Key figures in his network were arrested, and whistleblowers began coming forward, emboldened by the public outcry. Yet, Trent himself remained untouchable, protected by layers of power and influence. Then, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Victoria Hayes. Despite her initial reluctance, she decided to testify, providing first-hand accounts of Trent's crimes. Her bravery inspired others to do the same, and soon, the case against Trent grew too large to ignore. Finally, the day came when Marcus Trent was arrested. The image of him being led away in handcuffs was broadcast around the world, a symbol of justice prevailing against all odds. For Evelyn, it was a bittersweet victory. They had won, but the cost had been high. Carla's recovery was slow, and the scars of their ordeal would never fully heal. Yet, as she stood with Thomas and Jason, watching the news report of Trent's arrest, she felt a sense of peace. Lily's death had not been in vain, and their fight had made a difference.